At 3 a.m., the president of the HOA was ankle-deep in muddy water, screaming into her phone while her silver Lexus floated gently down the driveway like some cursed luxury boat heading straight into a neighbor's rose garden. Sirens wailed in the distance, flashing red and blue across the shimmering lake that used to be their perfectly manicured cul-de-sac. Sprinklers sparked and shorted out. Fruit trees cracked in the current. A garden gnome sailed past like a tiny, judgmental witness to chaos, and all I could think, standing dry on my porch with a coffee in hand, was this: I warned them. I told them digging that trench was a mistake. I told them to stay off my land, to leave my orchard alone. But no, they had to trespass. They had to slice through my trees, destroy years of soil work and root care like it meant nothing. So I gave them exactly what they asked for, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit more. You're probably wondering how things got this bad, how a quiet neighborhood turned into a disaster zone straight out of a FEMA training video. It's a fair question, because just a few months ago this place was peaceful. Birds sang, sprinklers whispered, and my orchard, my pride and joy, was in full bloom. Back then, I was just the guy who lived on the edge of the neighborhood, out of their jurisdiction, minding my own business. And they were just the HOA across the fence. But then came the puddle, the trench, the pipe, then came Karen, and that's when everything changed. My backyard was my sanctuary. I lived just outside the boundaries of Willow Ridge, a neighborhood run by one of those hyper-controlling homeowners associations that sends out color-coded newsletters and fines you if your grass is a quarter-inch too long. Thankfully, my property sat on unincorporated land, legally untouchable by their HOA nonsense. My house was modest, built with sweat, grit, and a budget held together by duct tape and faith. But behind it stretched my real treasure, a hand-planted orchard of pear, plum, and fig trees, with one scrappy apple tree that never produced more than 3 fruits a year but kept trying anyway. That orchard was therapy, legacy, and labor of love all rolled into one, and according to Karen, the newly minted HOA president, it was also an eyesore. Karen, yes, that was her real name, I swear, never introduced herself like a normal neighbor. Instead, she communicated through passive-aggressive newsletters she illegally slipped into my mailbox, signed with things like "Your friendly HOA" in bold font and veiled threats about community standards. She had that permanent squint, like the world personally offended her, and she always looked like she was moments away from writing a complaint to someone's manager. I ignored her. For months, she ignored me back. Then February came, and with it, relentless rain. One particularly soggy week left the back corner of Willow Ridge flooded, turning Susan from Lot 7's lawn into a miniature swamp. It was obvious to anyone with eyes and a middle school education that the problem was poor grading and a lazy drainage layout on their end. But logic does not exist in HOA meetings. Instead of fixing their own mistakes, Karen and her loyal lapdog, Dave from Lot 12, decided the puddle had to be someone else's fault. Guess who lived just downhill from the HOA's soggy disaster? According to a furious email that was blasted to the entire neighborhood, Google group subject line in all caps, and my address bolded, I was the contributing, non-compliant water flow source. Their words. Who even talks like that? I laughed at first. Then came the clipboard brigade, measuring imaginary runoff from my trees like I was operating a secret dam. Karen didn't contact me directly, of course not. Instead, she stoked paranoia, weaponized bureaucracy, and set the wheels of petty HOA retaliation in motion. They accused my orchard's irrigation system, which had been running peacefully for over 5 years, of trapping groundwater and redirecting moisture into their precious neighborhood. In reality, it was gravity doing its job. But facts didn't matter. Narrative did, and Karen was crafting one hell of a villain story, with me cast as the rogue landowner threatening their community's suburban bliss. I hadn't even seen the worst of it yet, because while I was still laughing at their ridiculous claims, the HOA was already drawing up plans to fix their so-called problem, plans that had nothing to do with their own land, plans that would slice through mine like it was theirs to command. And I had no idea what was coming. It started with the sound of machinery. I stepped outside one morning, coffee in hand, expecting bird song and maybe a breeze through the fig leaves. Instead, I saw a backhoe. Not in the distance, not parked politely near the road. No, this thing was half on my property, its treads pressed into the soil I had spent 5 years nurturing, and a crew of men in high-visibility vests were digging a narrow trench right along the shared property line. It sliced into the corner of my orchard like a knife through butter, tearing roots and upending earth without hesitation. I dropped my mug, ran toward them waving my arms, asked them what the hell they were doing. One guy shrugged, barely looking up from his shovel, said they were hired by the HOA to improve drainage. That trench ran straight through 2 of my plum trees, both of which had been standing tall since the day I planted them. One of them was already leaning, roots exposed like nerves. A fig tree sat nearby, punched sideways like it had taken a hit to the gut. I stood there in the mud, heart racing, fists clenched, while these strangers vandalized my land with the full blessing of a clipboard and a smile. I stormed across the street to Karen's house, phone in hand, camera rolling, rage simmering just below the surface. She opened the door like she had been expecting me, wine glass in hand, that fake smile plastered across her face like it was her job. I asked her, at first, politely, I swear, why her people were on my land, why they were digging through my orchard like it was a sandbox. She took a sip, looked me dead in the eye, and said it was necessary maintenance for the good of the neighborhood. I asked her when I gave permission for a trench to be carved through my trees. She gave a little laugh and said, "Oh, don't be so dramatic, it's just landscaping." Landscaping? She killed my figs for landscaping. I remember blinking, unsure if I had heard her right, while she just stood there, sipping Chardonnay and acting like she hadn't just committed felony. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was war. I documented everything, took photos, videos, called my insurance, hired a lawyer. He was polite, competent, and ultimately useless, because technically, legally, the trench was dug just outside the boundary that would make it an open and shut case. Technically, it was in that lovely little legal gray zone where damage was done, but no one would be held accountable without a fight that would cost more than my truck. The HOA, of course, had lawyers on retainer, the kind of people who write bylaws for fun and attend meetings just to feel powerful. Unless I was ready to spend years arguing over root systems and drainage codes, I was out of luck. But they weren't done, not even close. A few days later, I got a notice taped to my front door. Not mailed, not emailed, taped, like I was being served by a vindictive teenager. The notice accused me of malicious water redirection. Apparently my hose and gravity-fed watering system was now a threat to community safety. According to the document, my property posed a risk of intentional and negligent water dispersal. That phrase alone made me laugh so hard I had to sit down. But the laughter didn't last because the damage kept coming. The trench, poorly reinforced and left half open, became a channel for erosion. Another storm hit. 5 trees showed signs of stress. One of my pear trees collapsed entirely, roots torn from the earth like it had tried to flee and failed. I showed up to the next HOA meeting, photos in hand, prepared to speak. They told me it was a members-only session and had security escort me off the property. Security for a guy in flannel holding pictures of dying trees. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not in the scream at the skyway. This wasn't rage. It was precision, cold, quiet, calculated clarity. They had crossed a line, and now they were going to see what happened when you push someone too far, when you tear up their land and expect them to roll over. They wanted a flood? Fine, let's make it rain. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought the trench, the tree damage, the security guard escorting me off public property like I was some criminal with a watering can was the climax. But the HOA had only just gotten warmed up. A few days after I got tossed from that meeting, I came home to something that made my stomach drop. There, running through the back fence of my property, was a brand new concrete drainage pipe. Not beside it, not near the line, through it. Someone had cut a perfect hole through my wooden fence, pushed a pipe straight into my orchard, and sealed it off like it had always been there. No note, no explanation, just concrete, PVC, and the assumption that I would shut up and accept it. I stood there for a long time, flashlight in one hand, the other gripping the fence post so tightly my knuckles went white. The pipe sat there humming faintly with runoff, like a mechanical middle finger aimed right at my orchard. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the survey map I had printed when I first bought the land. That pipe was not just on my land, it was through it. But when I called the city to report it, I was met with shrugs and voicemail loops. When I finally got a human being, they told me the permit for the drainage expansion had already been approved, and according to the paperwork, the area in question was marked as community common space, which it had never been, which I had documents proving it wasn't. But none of that mattered, because the city had rubber-stamped the permit like it was nothing, like my orchard was a footnote. I filed a formal complaint, attached every photo, every timestamp, every record I had. They told me it would be weeks before anyone reviewed it. Meanwhile, the trench had deepened. The soil in my orchard had turned to sponge. Birds stopped nesting, roots rotted. Every time I looked out my window, I saw the land I had nurtured slowly dissolving under HOA arrogance. And they were still blaming me. A new notice arrived, this one in a bright red envelope, as if color could make nonsense legitimate. It accused me of violating water management ordinances and claimed my land was now the source of increasing flood risk to adjacent parcels. Translation, they built a system that funneled water into my yard, and now they were accusing me of the flooding it caused. I tried contacting my lawyer again, hoping maybe some new angle had opened up. He sounded half asleep and entirely disinterested. Technically, you have a case, he said while chewing something loudly, but they'll bury you in delays. Counterclaims and legal fees. You'll be 10 grand in before anyone even files a response. I thanked him, hung up, and stared out the window at the remains of my favorite plum tree, the one I planted first, the one I tied ribbons around to keep the rabbits away. It looked like a skeleton now, bark split, roots exposed like scars. That was the moment I realized the legal route was never going to fix this. Not because I wasn't right, but because they had money, power, and a system built to protect itself. I was alone and they knew it. That's why they kept pushing. Because they thought I had no options left, and for a while they were almost right. Almost. I don't know exactly when the rage turned into resolve, but I remember the moment I stopped being angry and started planning. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Still. Just me standing in the dark with a flashlight, staring at the pipe they had jammed through my fence like it belonged there, humming with runoff like a loaded weapon. That night, I called Eli. We went to college together. Civil engineer, dry humor, smarter than he let on. I told him everything, the trench, the orchard, the pipe, the HOA. Karen, there was a pause on the line, then he said the most beautiful sentence I had heard in months. If they're using gravity against you, he said, there's no reason you can't return the favor. I barely slept that night. By the time Eli pulled into my driveway the next morning, he had a topographic map, a laser level, and a cooler full of beer. We spent the whole day walking the property, checking slope angles, measuring elevation, studying where the HOA trench entered my land and where it was supposed to drain. And that's when we saw it. Their entire drainage setup only worked because my land absorbed the overflow. It was never designed to handle real volume. No exit strategy, no backup plan. It was a one-way system built on the assumption that I would keep taking the hit. So we came up with a different plan. Operation Reverse Flood. No destruction, no crimes, no lawsuits, just subtle landscaping. Technically legal, completely deniable, beautifully petty. First, I replaced the soft topsoil along the trench line with packed clay and gravel materials that resisted water absorption and redirected flow. Then I started planting, not random stuff, strategically chosen shrubs with deep roots that subtly shifted surface runoff toward a specific direction, downhill, toward them. But that was just the surface. The real masterpiece was underneath. Eli helped me design and install a covert French drain system, basically a hidden underground slide for water. It was nothing complicated, just a sloped trench filled with perforated piping and gravel, buried below the surface, angled to send any overflow right back. Where it came from, I worked slowly, deliberately, a little bit each night, with a headlamp, quiet tools and gloves. No one noticed. The HOA thought I had given up, retreated in defeat. They saw me in the yard and probably assumed I was trying to salvage my pathetic little orchard. They had no idea I was laying a trap. And the best part? I didn't need permits. According to city guidelines, I wasn't constructing a drainage structure. I was just improving my landscape, making it more water efficient, preparing for weather events. All perfectly legal. I even filed a small landscaping update form with the county just to be safe, describing the improvements in the blandest language I could think of. Soil reinforcement, erosion mitigation, native plantings, bureaucracy magic. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. The system was in place, tested, ready. All it needed was rain, and nature, bless her chaotic soul, delivered like she had been listening the whole time. The forecasts were dramatic. Words like torrential and historic kept popping up. Risk of flash flooding in low-lying areas. I watched the radar like a kid tracking Santa Claus. Then, 3 days before the storm hit, I got a certified letter from the HOA. Final warning, it accused me again of disruptive landscaping practices and ended with one very bold, underlined sentence. You are responsible for any damages caused by your actions. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the envelope. They had no idea what they had just written, no idea how poetic it would become. When the storm rolled in, it started as a soft drizzle. Then came the wind, the downpour, thunder like a war drum. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the water pour into the HOA trench system with mechanical efficiency. It filled quickly, too quickly. Their catch basin, installed at the lowest point of their common area, began to back up. Leaves and mulch clogged the grate. Water spilled over. Their newly poured concrete trench, slick and sloped, funneled it all straight toward the pipe sticking out of my property line. And that's when my system took over. The water entered my land, hit the French drain, and, without a whisper, changed course. Downhill, back toward their yards. I didn't have to do anything, just sit there and let gravity do the work. By midnight, I saw flashlights waving in panic, Karen in a bathrobe screaming into her phone, standing knee-deep in rising water. Patio furniture floated, flower beds turned into muddy swamps. Their precious walking trail disappeared under a river of runoff. I could hear radios crackling as emergency crews arrived, fire trucks parked just outside the flood zone. City maintenance teams waded in with clipboards and long faces. I stayed on my porch, still sipping coffee, watching the show unfold like opening night at a very wet theater. One of the engineers pointed at the trench and muttered, "Whose idea was this?" I kept a straight face and said, "I think it was an HOA initiative, something about redirecting runoff." He nodded grimly. "Well, it redirected all right. I didn't need to say anything else." They were drowning in their own plan. A plan that only worked because I had once let my land be their sponge. Now that sponge had teeth, and I wasn't done. Not yet. The rain did not politely arrive. It attacked. By early evening, the skies over Willow Ridge turned the color of wet cement, thick and brooding, and then split open like the universe had something to prove. Rain hammered down in sheets, blurring the line between street and sidewalk, soaking everything in sight. I watched from my porch, a thermos of coffee in hand, dry and calm while the first layers of water collected in the HOA's beautifully over-engineered trench system. For the first hour, it looked like their grand plan might actually work. The water rushed smoothly into their shiny concrete channels, snaking along the edges of the subdivision and shooting right into the trench mouth that pointed directly at my property. It was like watching a machine. Pinnacle, efficient, arrogant. But what they didn't realize was that machines break, and nature does not care about blueprints. As the rain intensified, the trench began to choke. The catch basin at the lowest point of their common area filled too fast. The metal grate clotted with leaves, flower bed mulch, and all the decorative bark Karen insisted on refreshing every 2 weeks. Water backed up, spilled over the edge, and began sloshing into places it wasn't designed to reach. By 10 p.m., the concrete trench overflowed. Water burst over its slick sides and streamed down every slope it could find, which, as designed, meant my land. Only this time, it didn't stop there. As soon as it hit my trench, my French drain came to life like a silent predator. Beneath the surface, the system kicked into gear, redirecting the surge underground away from my home, down the slope, and right back into the lowest points of Willow Ridge. It didn't cause the flood. It simply gave the flood a new path. The water returned home. By midnight, panic had replaced smugness. Flashlights danced in the dark as HOA members ran from house to house, shouting, dragging sandbags too late to matter. I saw a plastic Adirondack chair floating like a lazy barge past someone's hydrangeas. One neighbor stood on his driveway in disbelief as his grill bobbed sideways and tipped into a flower bed. I spotted Karen near the clubhouse in a bathrobe and boots, clutching her phone to her ear and shouting into it with all the authority of a dethroned monarch. Her silver Lexus, once parked proudly in the driveway like a suburban trophy, now glided gracefully down the gentle slope of her yard, nose first into someone else's lawn. I couldn't hear her words, but I didn't need to. The frantic gestures, the wild glances in my direction, it was all clear. She was trying to reach the city, the fire department, her lawyer, God. But none of them could stop what had already started. The current had taken over. The HOA's plan had become its undoing. Their precious runoff system, the trench they cut through my orchard, the pipe they forced through my fence, it all worked exactly as designed, only now gravity had picked a side. The water poured back into their homes, their flower beds, their basements. The storm didn't let up. It roared through the night, pounding the earth like it was settling a score. I watched with eerie calm, the way people watch wildfires from a distance. There was nothing I needed to do, no buttons to push, no switches to flip. I had already done my part. The rest was physics. By 3 a.m., sirens filled the air. A fire truck rolled in, followed by a couple of squad cars and a city maintenance vehicle. They parked at the front of the neighborhood, where the flooding hadn't yet reached, but even from my porch, I could see the confusion on their faces as they surveyed what looked like a suburban Atlantis. Emergency lights reflected off the waterlogged cul-de-sac like it was a lake. A garden gnome floated past, face up as if silently judging everyone involved. Karen was still out there, standing ankle-deep in rising water, screaming into her phone, while the world she had tried so hard to control unraveled around her. Her kingdom was drowning, Her trench was a failure, and she had no one left to blame. The best part? They didn't know it was me. As far as they could tell, the flood was the result of poor planning, heavy rain, and an unfortunate combination of bad luck and worse engineering. No proof, no evidence, just nature doing what it does best, finding balance. I turned off the porch light. No need to gloat, not yet. The damage was done. The trench was broken, the catch basin useless. They had no clue that their downfall had been built in silence, one shovelful at a time beneath their noses. And as the rain finally began to ease, as the water sat like a warning over every inch of their carefully curated lawns, I smiled and whispered to myself the one thing they never understood. Water always flows downhill, especially when you help it remember where home is. The morning after the storm, the neighborhood looked like a war zone, dressed in khakis and lawn flamingos. Lawns were shredded, mulch had gathered into strange, swirling piles of mud, and the beloved walking trail was submerged under 6 inches of gritty runoff. The trench that had once gleamed like a suburban monument to control was now a broken scar filled with stagnant brown water that smelled like failure. City engineers arrived mid-morning, clipboards in hand, eyes wide. I played the part of the concerned neighbor flawlessly, standing just close enough to overhear, just far enough to seem uninvolved. One of the guys muttered something under his breath as he pointed at the collapsed catch basin. I handed him a thermos of coffee and said I believed the drainage system was an HOA project, something about redirecting community runoff. He shook his head. Well, it redirected all right. By noon, a crowd had gathered in front of Karen's house. Some were soaked, others shouting, a few crying. People waved phones, insurance papers, photos of their flooded basements. Karen emerged in a blazer, clearly an attempt at damage control, but it only made her look more out of touch. Her lawn was wrecked, the water line still visible on the garage door, and her Lexus had been towed some time before sunrise. She raised her hands and tried to talk, but no one was listening. The crowd had turned. Her empire was collapsing right in front of her, and the same neighbors who once nodded politely now glared like villagers at Frankenstein's castle. The best part? I never had to say a word. I stood on my porch, trimming the last of my surviving fig tree, listening to the chaos. That night, I finally opened the certified letter she had sent me before the storm, the one that warned I would be held responsible for any damages caused by my landscape. I laughed, slid it into a folder marked evidence, and poured myself a drink. But the real twist came the next morning, when someone slid a letter under my door. No envelope, just a neatly typed message with 5 words. At the top, "We need to talk urgently, Karen." I stared at it for a long time, sipping lukewarm coffee, letting those words settle. "We need to talk urgently." 5 words that reeked of surrender and tasted like desperation. Curiosity won. Around noon I walked over, deliberately wearing mud-stained jeans and a wrinkled shirt topped with the same straw hat she once mocked as Farmer Core. Her yard was a swamp. The newsletter she'd proudly distributed now stuck to the porch floor like a badge of shame. She opened the door looking like she hadn't slept in days, hoodie damp, hair a mess, and eyes wide with the weight of defeat. "Thank you for coming," she said, like this was a brunch invite and not the aftermath of her own self-made disaster. I didn't sit. She jumped straight in. "We need access to your land. The city's demanding we correct the drainage issue immediately. They're threatening fines, lawsuits. We need your cooperation." I stared at her, letting the silence drag. "You want me to help clean up the mess you made?" She tried the unity angle. "We're all neighbors. We're in this together." I almost laughed. "You know, Karen," I said as I turned to leave, "you really should have left the orchard alone." Karen lasted another week. She tried to hold a special meeting, but barely anyone showed up. One by one, the board members resigned, citing stress, liability, and in one case, quote-unquote, unforeseen landscaping complications. Someone spray-painted "Drain Queen" across Karen's garage door. Another neighbor forwarded the original trench schematics to the entire community email list, along with a scathing breakdown of how the HOA had ignored every professional recommendation. The insurance company denied almost every claim, citing gross negligence, and that was the final spark. Within days, a formal motion to dissolve the current HOA board was filed. Karen, to her credit, clung to her position like a woman gripping the rail of a sinking ship. But even she had limits. Her resignation letter was typed in all caps, defensive and riddled with legal jargon, but it ended with one beautiful sentence that I printed, framed, and hung inside my tool shed next to a wooden plaque that read, "Don't start, none will be none." The sentence read, "Effective immediately, I resign as president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association." The aftermath was chaotic but strangely satisfying. The HOA had to hire a third-party contractor to rebuild the entire drainage system. This time with proper permits, actual city supervision, and soil surveys that didn't involve guessing. They paid for it using their emergency fund, which promptly ran dry. Dues were doubled. That went over about as well as a root canal in a church potluck. Karen sold her house at a loss and moved to a gated community across town. I wished them luck. As for me, I started to rebuild not because I had forgiven anyone, but because the land deserved better. I brought in fresh soil, planted new trees, and used part of the small settlement I squeezed out of the city to build a greenhouse. The birds returned. The bees came back. The orchard grew. One afternoon, while harvesting my first batch of pears from the new trees, a kid pedaled by on his bike and shouted, "Hey, aren't you the guy who flooded the HOA?" I smiled and called back, "I prefer neighborhood hydrologist, but yeah, that was me." He laughed and rode off, and I stood there for a second, holding a ripe pear in my hand, thinking about how ridiculous and perfect it all was. They called my orchard a problem, a nuisance, an eyesore. Funny thing about nature, it always finds balance, just like water, just like karma.